Good evening, everybody, and good evening to all those who are joining us live on Facebook on our live stream. What's in it for me is a good thing. If you weren't able to read that acronym, by the way, don't despair.
I got it.
That's just another symbol of today's vernacular, common vernacular. Like, I will meet you, as in letter U. You know, this is the way things are spelled in today's world. So, WIIFM, what's in it for me is a good thing. That's tonight's lesson. Judaism is not about spirituality, it is about life. So, what's in it for me is a common American refrain. We hear this all the time, especially in the business world. What's in it for me? Why should I do this? Why should I bother? What's in it for me? What do I stand to gain? This is normal. So that is very common. Altruism, doing things, bringing benefit to other people for the sake of bringing benefit to other people, this is something that's a little bit more difficult to find. This moral practice of genuine concern for happiness of other human beings, this is something that's a little harder to come by. And altruism usually needs to cost us something. It needs to cost us sometimes our comfort, sometimes our enjoyment, sometimes our pleasure, sometimes our convenience. The Torah tells us, for example, "V'ahavta l'reyacha kamocha," we are enjoined, we are obligated to love our fellow Jew as ourselves. So even though ourselves, so we would have certain things we would do for ourselves, but for the other person, not so sure. The other person, we'll be willing to go out of our way, but to the degree that we would go out of way for ourselves, that's already different. So the Torah tells us we need to put ourselves aside for another person. There's also an idea of altruism with respect to the fulfillment of mitzvahs, with respect to the fulfillment of the Torah's laws, and that means that we fulfill them even though it may not be comfortable, it may not be convenient for us. Like Rabbi Newbord always want to say, when it's raining or when it's snowing, and somebody shows up for the minyan, he says, this is what separates the men from the boys. You show up for the minyan, even though it's raining, even though it's snowing, you're the man. You're the man. In other words, it's really meaningful to you, it's really important to you, and so even though it may not be comfortable, even though it may not be convenient, you still do it anyway. And just as an aside, and I'm in no way saying that this is an attribute that I can claim to have fully embraced or fully internalized. However, when I was a young child, so I grew up in my parents' home. My parents are shluchim of the Rebbe in Farmington Hills, Michigan, Chabad shluchim, since 1977 or 76. Somewhere around there. Predates my involvement in this physical reality. I was born in 1979. So they had an open home. And very often we were asked to give up our beds for guests. And all I could say is that as much discomfort as it caused me when I was a child, I remain internally indebted to them for doing that. Why? Because it ingrained in me a certain sense of, yes, give up your space, give up what you hold, to be the most hallowed space of your life. I'm not talking about, God forbid, in an abusive way, but I'm saying, this is my room, this is my bed, this is my space. Why should I give it up? No, you give it up for another person, and that perhaps was one of the greatest values that I took from there, from my formidable years. So I just think this is just another. It's an example of ingraining that, of teaching, conveying this message, conveying this value. But now the question needs to be asked. Okay, but what if I do a mitzvah and I'm not 100% sure that I'm actually doing it just for God? I'm doing it a little bit for myself. Maybe I'm really doing it for myself. Maybe I'm just as self-absorbed as everybody else is. And it's just that I think that I found the best way to to fulfillment. Torah is fulfillment, fulfilling, so I found the best way to fulfill, self-fulfillment. So let's see what the Torah has to say about this question. And we begin with the first opening text of this week's Parsha. Sorry about all that interference. So we begin with the opening text of this week's Parsha, text number 1 on page 84 in your textbooks. If you follow my statutes, this is the opening of this week's Parshas Bechukotai. If you follow my statutes and observe my commandments and perform them, I will give your rains in their time. The land will yield its produce, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit. Your threshing will last until the vintage, and the vintage will last until the sowing. You will eat your food to satiety. Could you correct me? Satiety. Okay, thank you. And you will live in security in your land. And I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down with no one to frighten you. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and no army will pass through your land. So this is the very beginning of this week's Parsha. We are told that if we fulfill the mitzvahs, if we do what God is asking us to do, then God will respond in kind. He will reward us with many wonderful physical rewards. And so the Torah is telling us that we have tangible and personal benefit in the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. Now one would think that if it's a Torah of truth, Torah is emes, so we would need to fulfill the Torah even if the rain is not coming down, and even if it's not secure, and come what may, we still have to fulfill the mitzvahs. And in fact, we are told to do this in the Ethics of the Fathers, a very famous statement in the Ethics of the Fathers right at the beginning. In text number 2, Antignos of Socho, that was the name of the sage, received the tradition from Shimon, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous. He would say, do not be as slaves who serve their master for the sake of reward, rather be as slaves who serve their master not for the sake of reward. And the fear of heaven should be upon you. So that sounds more like it, that we're supposed to fulfill the mitzvahs just because God gave us the mitzvahs. So why does the Torah even discuss reward, physical reward, let alone why doesn't the Torah make any mention of spiritual reward? And as we know, the very famous question that, I don't want to say plagued, but it definitely occupied a lot of space in medieval writings, and is that the Torah doesn't specifically talk about Olam Haba. It doesn't specifically talk about the world to come.
But
the world of the spirit.
There are some hints, no?
Obviously, of course, because it's a basic tenet of our belief. Yeah. It's not one of the 13. One of the 13 principles is that God rewards and punishes. So the question is, okay, so where does he reward and punish? Sometimes people don't get their punishment here. Sometimes people don't get the reward here. So it's obvious that there is another realm in which they do. However, an explicit reference to Olam Haba in the Torah is not clear. We have that in the oral tradition. We have it in the writings of the Talmud, and we have it in the writings of later stages, etc., but it's not in the written Torah. So why the Torah does tell us, though, about a physical reward. So first of all, if we're supposed to fulfill the mitzvahs out of altruistic motive, then why tell us about the reward altogether? Just tell us to do the mitzvahs and finished. Secondly, why does the Torah not tell us anything about the spiritual? In the words of the Abarbanel, in the words of the famous sage, the Abarbanel, in text number 3, he says, why do all the promises and rewards of the Torah pertain to physical matters, as mentioned in the covenant at the beginning of Bechukotai? Why are we not promised completeness of the soul and reward of the soul, which take place after death, inasmuch as the soul is the ultimate purpose of man, his truest success and essential goodness? Our enemies have laid siege to the gate with this verse, using it to deny that there is spiritual reward for a Jew after death. Furthermore, how is it possible for the crops to produce their yield according to the observance of the commandments? How can the reward for one who observes a mitzvah be rain in the land at the proper time, and the punishment for a sinner be that the rain is withheld? That's his question. So the Abarbanel, the Yitzchak Abarbanel, was one of the major commentaries on the Torah. He was a great Spanish.
Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, no?
Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, correct.
Why
Yeah.
they call him Don?
That was, it could be, I don't know, not from,
In
I don't know.
Spanish, don is a form of respect.
It was a dignitary,
So,
so it could be that's the reason.
interesting.
He's not the only one who's called Don. So it could be that's where it comes from. But he was a Spanish sage. He was very close with the Spanish king and queen, those who expelled the Jews. He tried to intervene. Things didn't exactly work out the way he wanted it, and ultimately the Jews were expelled. But he was alive at that time, and one of his famous works, Yeshua's Mashiach, is a work focused on the question of the Messiah, the whole concept of redemption, talking about how this is all part of our the true Jewish belief. Anyway, getting back to the point here, the Abarbanel features, he brings down 7 different answers, 7 different responses that are provided in various works to respond to this question. And so we're going to talk about 2 of them. We're not going to talk about all of them, we're just going to talk about 2 of these answers. And the first one is that of Rambam, the Maimonides. Maimonides is one of the greatest sages. He tells us in text number 4, a question arises. As explained, the reward for the mitzvahs and the good that we will merit if we observe the path of God as prescribed by the Torah in the world to come. If so, what is the meaning of the statements made throughout the entire Torah that if you observe the Torah's laws, you will acquire such and such? If you do not observe the Torah's laws, such and such will happen to you. All of the benefits and difficulties that are promised are matters of this material world. For example, plenty and famine, war and peace, sovereignty over the nations, over other nations, or a humble national standing, the settlement of the land or exile, success in one's deeds or loss, and all other points mentioned in the covenant. So his question is that the reward really is in the world to come. But yet, the Torah, when the Torah speaks of it, it speaks of physical reward, tangible reward. In resolution, it must be stated that all those statements are true. They have been realized in the past and will be realized in the future. When we fulfill all the mitzvahs in the Torah, we will acquire all the benefits of this world. Nevertheless, those benefits are not the ultimate reward for the mitzvahs, nor are those evils the ultimate retribution to be exacted from someone who transgresses all the mitzvahs. Just to try to make some sense of what he's telling us here, is in saying that the reward that we would get here in this physical world isn't the ultimate reward. The ultimate reward would be in the world of the spirit. So there's a great mashal, a great analogy that sometimes is drawn to explain how what happens down here is but a minute expression, a small, glimmer of what is really going on above. The Alter Rebbe brings us down in Tanya. It's a great mashal, it's a great analogy. He says, think about the sun. When on our sundial, it moves. Right? The time moves. How many miles is the sun actually traveling?
Well, that's known, but not by any of us, presumably.
But if we were to come up with a mathematical number, right? Tremendous amount, right? Hundreds of thousands of miles, right? Anytime you, obviously based on how much of that measurement, how much of that movement would be taken, right? But the point is that the sun moves in huge leaps and bounds. And yet down here, how is it reflected? In just a small measure.
It's the other way around.
It's the Earth that's
the
moving.
Earth's
revolves around the sun.
Okay, that's already a question of...
No, the revolving is the year, rotating is the day.
But I'm
Rotates
talking about
on
on your
its
sundial.
axis.
So it's talking about the
That's a whole separate question of
not
what...
the year.
It's a separate question of what is it called? The geo... whatever the case. I don't want to get into this... huh?
Astronomy.
No, I don't want to get into this whole discussion now. I don't want to derail our discussion here. The point being that when the sun moves a lot, it's only reflected in a small measure here. It's not a matter of what rotates around the other. It's not that who cares about that. That's not the question. The point is that when the sun moves a lot, down here it's reflected even if we're viewing it from our perspective, we're seeing the sun move. To us, the sun is moving. Okay. So what he's saying here is that the benefit that we would get in Olam Haba is much larger, much greater, a much greater proportion than whatever benefit we would be getting down here. What happens down here is merely a glimmer of what's really happening above. So rather, the resolution of the matter is as follows. God gave us this Torah, which is a tree of life. Whoever fulfills what is written within it and comprehends it with complete and proper knowledge will merit the life of the world to come. In addition, we are promised by the Torah that we fulfill it with joy and good spirit and meditate on its wisdom at all times. God will remove all the obstacles that prevent us from fulfilling it. For example, sickness, war, famine, and the like. So what he's telling us here is that what God is promising by saying the rain will fall in its time and the harvest will come in its time and everything will work properly, what God is doing is removing the roadblocks. He's taking out the obstacles to fulfilling the Torah in its fullest measure. That's the reward. It's not that the ultimate reward is having the rain in its time and having physical, tangible benefit, but rather that those are simply the removal of obstacles so that you can fulfill the Torah mitzvahs in full measure and then ultimately merit the world to come. That's Rambam's explanation. Similarly, he will grant us all the good which will reinforce our performance of the Torah, such as plenty, peace, and an abundance of silver and gold, in order that we not be involved throughout all our days in matters required by the body, but rather will sit unburdened and thus have the opportunity to study wisdom and perform mitzvahs in order that we will merit the life of the world to come. This is Rambam's shita in general, that the ultimate purpose of all of existence is the world to come, not the physical world. And Rambam has a difference of opinion with Ramban, Nachmanides.
Yeah, that's a very big dispute between them.
Yeah. So who sides with whom?
I know Chabad is with the Ramban.
Kabbalah and Hasidus accepts the Ramban's view that the ultimate purpose is not the world of the soul, but rather the world of the body. The ultimate purpose. In other words, what does God want from all of it? Where will the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan be manifest, specifically in the world of the physical, specifically in the physical world?
I'm not sure I'm getting it. What you said.
In other words,
just exactly what you said. What does God really want from our reality? What does He really want? He really wants the physical body to be purified, to be elevated, to be refined, and that the divine be more manifest and be more revealed here in this world, here in our reality. We should see that this table and this piece of flesh is actually a manifestation of God's power. Today we don't see that. Today we see ourselves as independent. We're separate from God. We see ourselves as separate from God. We think we are separate from God. The ultimate purpose is that we reach a point where everything is simply
God.
Telling you it's an expression of godliness. And the amazement, the admiration that would result from that is incredible.
I read some place that in the Kabbalah it says that every face of a human being on earth has a reflection of God. Some.
Well, that's already in Bereshis. We're told that every creation, every human being is created b'tselem Elokim, is created in the image of God, whatever image means.
But that's the big, I think, to some degree misunderstanding, because God has no image. So that's
so Rambam understands that to mean the seichel, the intellect. So every human being has intellect, and that's the tzelem Elokim. And so then the question becomes, so what's unique about a Jew? And we discussed this last week between Mincha and Ma'ariv. You were there. You remember that because a Jew has a godly soul, so the godly soul sees reality through God's lenses. And that godly soul impresses upon the intellect that a Jew has, that the intellect becomes altogether a different type of intellect. Meaning it's an intellect which now is sensitive to a different reality. So that's why a Jew has an easier time perceiving of godliness, perceiving of something that's beyond itself than one who's not a Jew. That doesn't mean the other person is not created in God's image. They're also created in God's image. They also have value. They also deserve respect. They also deserve dignity. It doesn't take it away. It's just that a Jewish person has a godly soul, a godly sensitivity to the divine. Okay. Now, even though Rambam tells us that yes, the ultimate reward is the world to come, that's Rambam Shita. Again, that's different than Nachmanides, different than Chassidus, different than Kabbalah. But even Rambam tells us that shouldn't be the primary motivator of doing mitzvahs. In text number 5, one who serves God out of love, occupies himself in the Torah and mitzvahs, and walks in the paths of wisdom for no ulterior motive, not because of fear that evil will occur, nor in order to acquire benefit. Rather, he does what is true because it is true, and ultimately good will come because of it. This is a very high level, which is not merited by every wise man. It is the level of our patriarch Abraham, whom God described as he who loved me. Avram Oihavi, for his service was only motivated by love.
A lot of secular people use it as a way to, I would say, upset religious people, pay their attention. I do it not because of rabbi, let's say they volunteer. I know a lot of secular people volunteer to give food, to sick people, all kinds of things, a lot of charity in Israel, but they say, however, lehavdil, we do it not because a rabbi told us, or chas v'chalila, of course Hashem says it, but they say not because Hashem said to us, because we think it's the right thing.
Right.
So it's very hard to explain them that it's actually...
I think it's very easy.
Embodied.
I think it's very easy. Let me tell you why I think it's very easy.
Okay.
Because today I think this is the right thing to do, and tomorrow I think it's the wrong thing to do. And so what happens to society when society tomorrow decides, these people who we thought really are worthy of our kindness, today we decide, what, they're not worthy of our kindness. And so now these people are left out to die, or these people are shot to death, these people are gassed, these people are murdered, they're taken in gas chamber, God forbid.
That's a really...
In other words, if all you're relying on is your own intellect, your own calculations, it's not rooted in absolute values, then you're bound to get confused. You're bound to make a mistake.
I agree, but they use example, let's say, that is coming from the Torah.
So this is another discussion. How would we respond to a secular person, who has a problem with doing kindness? But without derailing our discussion into something else, let's go finish this last paragraph. God commanded us to seek this rung of service as conveyed by Moshe, as Devarim Deuteronomy 6:5 states, love God, your Lord. When a man will love God in the proper manner, he will immediately perform all the mitzvahs motivated by love. So all the positive commandments will all be fulfilled. Why? Because it's being driven out of the love of God. In other words, I love God, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because God wants me to. Like you would do for your own spouse or the person that you feel love towards. You would do what they want, not necessarily because it's convenient, not because you enjoy it, but because they're asking for it. Okay. So there's a great story of the Baal Shem Tov. I'll just share it with you in short. Baal Shem Tov wanted to go to the land of Israel, and he tried going once, and he got stuck in Turkey. And he was there over Pesach, and apparently he had nothing. There was nothing left. He didn't have any provisions. He didn't have any matzah or maror. Somehow he ended up without anything. He's there with his daughter. And not just he's there.
Pesach is already happening? It's already Pesach and they have nothing, or before Pesach?
This is right before Pesach.
Okay.
He was on his way to Israel. He desperately wanted to get to Israel, and he has nothing. So he not just he didn't have anything physical, he didn't have any provisions that he had brought with him. They got lost at sea, or whatever the story was. He also had suffered a spiritual decline, like all of his insight, all of his great depth, and for the time being, was taken away from him. Okay, comes Erev Pesach, and what are they going to do? They have nothing. So suddenly this guy shows up. And he says, I'm a businessman, I come from Poland, and blah, 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 and I'm looking, I hear there are some other Jews here from, my neighborhood, somewhere around where I come from, and I understand you're good, so I want to celebrate Pesach with you. So they said, well, you're welcome to celebrate Pesach with us, but we got nothing. We don't even have a piece of matzah, not even a cup of wine to make kiddush. We have nothing. So don't worry, I have everything. He has everything. He has everything. He has all the matzah, he has all the wine, the murr, he has everything. Okay. So they have Pesach, so they have a wonderful time together, and the man, after experiencing Pesach together with the Baal Shem Tov, you can imagine what kind of Pesach that was. He turns to the Baal Shem Tov and asks him for a blessing. He says, I'm a wealthy man. I've been blessed with riches, with wealth, but the one thing that my wife and I have not been blessed with is children. Can you please give me a bracha for children? So the Baal Shem Tov gave him a bracha for children, and he said, within the year, you're going to have a child. Baal Shem Tov is informed by his heavenly connections that there's a heavenly voice that's called out, that announces that the Baal Shem Tov has now lost his portion in the world to come. Why? Because it was decreed that this man not have a child. And here the Baal Shem Tov is almost like he's forcing the hand of heaven to reward this man with a child, and so they're going to siphon off some of they're going to take it away from the Baal Shem Tov. The world to come, the merit of the world to come is going to come from the Baal Shem Tov. We have there's a supply and demand.
So everything is taken.
So his portion of the world to come is gone. So the Baal Shem Tov turns around and says, Baruch Hashem, thank God. I always suspected that maybe my Torah and mitzvahs, my studying Torah, my film to mitzvahs, might be somehow motivated by the fact that I'm going to have a portion of the world to come. Thank God now I have no portion of the world to come. Nothing's getting in the way. Now I have no concern that is going to be an ulterior motive.
Wow.
So I think in the end they gave him back his portion of the world to the world to come. That's usually the way it works. It's like the mashal. It's like the analogy we talked about in the first lesson of the prayer course that we're giving now. There was this king. He gave everybody an opportunity to come visit his palace, and there were multiple chambers. One chamber had wonderful, beautiful musicians. The other one had artwork. The other one was anybody could come and take from the king's his wealth. They can select some several pieces of jewelry, whatever it was, and people come in. One person gets enchanted with the music. The other person gets completely overwhelmed with the artwork, beautiful artwork. They're busy with the artwork. The other one gets busy with with the gold and the silver, with the diamonds, whatever. There was one individual who was intelligent, says the Baal Shem Tov, and he goes up and he approaches the king himself, and he says, you know what I want? I want to have the opportunity to speak to you 3 times every day. And the king says, that's a smart guy. He realizes that the ultimate benefit really is not what lies in the antechambers, all the diversions. That's not ikr. That's not the primary element here. What's most valuable is having a relationship with the king himself. And then the king turns around and says, now that you've chosen that, I'm going to give you whatever you want from the other chambers as well. So it's a similar type of thing here. Baal Shem Tov says, Baruch Hashem, now I have no concern that my Olam Haba, this whole concept of Olam Haba, is getting in the way of my fulfillment of mitzvahs for their own sake. And then ultimately, when a person has reached that level, so then perhaps they'll give him back the Olam Haba, but again, it's not going to be an inhibition. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to be a game changer for him. Oh, I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah. I'm not going to fulfill it. It's all the same thing. Yeah, I do the mitzvahs. Why? Because God wants me to. I'm sorry, you had a question.
No, yeah, so apparently this person who met the Baal Shem Tov, even he had the decree, had some merit to meet the Baal Shem Tov and to
I'm sure.
get...
I'm sure of. It's a merit to be able to meet a person like the Baal Shem Tov. Without a question.
So he did get the child?
He had the child in the end. Sure, he had the child. Sure.
So he was able to cancel the decree of Baal Shem Tov.
That's the point. Yeah, because he was able to turn over the, to turn over the decree. So therefore, it turns out that they had to take away his Olam Haba. That was the discussion. That was the point. Okay. So now, The second approach to the question of why the Torah gives us these physical rewards is that it's a concession to the internally flawed human state. This is the way it's described by one of the commentaries. This is the Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Rabban Ibn Ezra, in text number 6. Continuing where we left off in text number 6, in my opinion, the Torah was given to everyone and not to one individual alone. Matters of the world to come will not be understood but by 1 in 1,000, for they are deep. So therefore, the Torah tells us, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you physical reward. I'm going to give you physical reward. The physical reward, this is for the vast majority of people who can't appreciate the deeper layer, the deeper understanding of the world to come. People who can't relate to the world to come, okay. So this is in text number 7, Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra opines in Parshas Azinu, this is text number 7, page 92, that in my opinion, the Torah was given to everyone and not to one individual alone. Matters of the world to come will not be understood but by 1 in 1,000, for they are deep. His opinion is that it is difficult for people to imagine such spiritual reward, for a corporal person cannot understand something spiritual. Therefore, the Torah hid such spiritual matters from the masses due to their lack of intellectual ability. This is his opinion. To just explain this a little bit, this idea of actually enjoying something spiritual, we have 4 basic categories of pleasure. There's the physical, most tangible type. You eat something and it tastes good. Then we listen to beautiful music. That might be a whole nother, more refined layer or level of pleasure. And then hearing something, seeing, like a beautiful piece of artwork, taking pleasure in a beautiful design of a palace. Wow, isn't that incredible? It's beautiful. Look at these beautiful mountains, the landscape. The pleasure of sight. And then you have a higher level of pleasure, which is that which you understand. People who understand, if you understand the concept, you enjoy it. And that's what motivates people to study if you're so inclined. I love learning, and that's why I keep studying. I keep opening this book and finish. I open a book. I eat the books. I eat the pages. Why am I doing that? Because I just enjoy it. I enjoy understanding. I enjoy advancing in my knowledge. This is a spiritual enjoyment. It's not a physical one. It's as physical as you can. It's as spiritual as you can get within the physical realm. There's a great story, a beautiful story of a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, a disciple of the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, who was very wealthy. And he would give tzedakah. He was a philanthropist. And yet, when he would give tzedakah, sometimes he felt like he was benefiting. He felt like, he felt good. And so he came to the Alter Rebbe to say, I'm not giving tzedakah with an emes. I'm not giving tzedakah with truth. And therefore, I'm thinking cutting down in my donations. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, you may not be giving it with an emes, but the pauper who's now having his meal, who's eating his meal, he's eating be'emes, he's really eating. He's truthfully eating. So you might not be intending it for the truth, but he is really receiving it for the truth. In other words, his receipt of your benevolence is real. And so I don't think this fellow cut back on his donations afterwards. But this, again, speaks to this idea that most people feel that, they're kind of tied to their personal inclinations. Like, I give, I feel good about it. It's hard for me to divorce myself from that. There's also another great story.
But that's part of love, is giving, in general. So when even if you don't have that true feeling, it's there. Someone taking is not as high as giving.
For sure. 100%. There's another great story. Whether or not it actually happened is another question. But it's a great story nonetheless. And it may come across a little bit tragic, but it also brings across the point very, I think it brings across the message. So in a small town in Eastern Europe somewhere, there was a very wealthy man. And he was a miser. He didn't like giving charity.
Miser?
A miser. Yeah. Haya kamtzan. Mod kamtzani. So what happens? People would knock on his door and he'd send them away. I'm not giving you anything. I'm sorry. Finally, one day, there's a pauper who's starving. He absolutely has nothing to eat. And he's dying. And he meets this fellow, he meets this miser, and he says, please, or he knocks on his door, please give me something to eat. So the guy rummages through his garbage. I see you're already cringing. He rummages through his garbage, and he takes out a rotten old piece of fish that was left there, and he throws it to him. And the pauper goes and eats it faster than you can imagine. And then, perhaps even before he has the chance to make it after blessing, this guy is dead. This pauper is dead.
Give him poisoned fish.
So what happens? So now there's a levaya. There's a levaya is a funeral. So this wealthy miser who loves to do mitzvahs puts on his coat and tells his wife, "I'm having a very busy day today. There's a levaya I have to go to. I have to attend to this levaya, to this funeral. I'm going to go to a funeral." So he goes to the funeral. He makes sure that the body is taken care of. He attends the funeral. He is melava the mace. He accompanies the dead. You have to accompany the dead at least 4 cubits, about 6 feet. You walk together with the mace, and then he leaves over. He has one orphan, so he has to go be malat menachem avel. He has to go and comfort the mourners. So he has so many mitzvahs going for him, and he's all excited. And his wife asks him, "Why are you excited today? That you have what are you excited about?" He says, "Since when was the last time I had a chance to get 4 mitzvahs for a stinky old piece of fish?" That's so many mitzvahs. I can get to go to a funeral. I get to go to comfort the mourner. Again, like I made a disclaimer before I told you the story that whether or not the story happened in actuality is not the question. Is not the point. The point
what
is
the point of the story?
The point is the backwards way of looking at mitzvahs.
Okay.
Why am I'm looking to get mitzvahs? I'm looking to chabarain. Chabarain is a Yiddish expression which means I want to catch as many mitzvahs as I can. I want to catch enough mitzvahs so I have more slusim, so I have more merit. That's what gives me. It gives me more merit. So you know what I can do? I can actually kill somebody with a smelly, stinky rotten piece of fish. And with that, you know what I earn? I earn for myself 4 mitzvahs.
Then he was really ignorant, because isn't life the basic mitzvah?
Lo tirtzach is before.
It's an avera.
He married her.
Without getting into the technicalities, there's no question about it that
There's a scale.
there's a lot to be said about this person. Beyond his being just an ignoramus.
Right.
So, but the point is that we have sometimes a warped view of mitzvahs. We look at mitzvahs as though they're opportunities for merit. Yeah, it's true, they bring us merit. But that's not the way we should view mitzvahs. We view a mitzvah as this is God's eternal will. God wants us to be here in order that we can do that mitzvah. And therefore we're going to do that mitzvah. We're going to do the mitzvah because that's what God wants us to do. Now let's probe a whole new layer of understanding our relationship with Torah. And with that, we're going to try to respond to the question we asked earlier about why the Torah is giving us a physical reward, a tangible reward for the mitzvahs. In Devarim, in Deuteronomy, here's what the Torah tells us in text number 8. To love God, to love the Lord your God, to listen to his voice and to cleave to him. For that is your life. I'll read that again. For that is your life and the length of your days. To dwell in the land that God swore to your forefathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and to give to them. What does this mean, for that is your life? What does it mean? So one interpretation is that God and his Torah ought to be the only objects of devotion in our lives, through which we merit eternal life. So here is what he says in the Seforno. The Seforno is one of the commentaries on the Chumash in text number 9. For that is your life, for your cleaving to him is your real life, the reason why you will enjoy eternal life. So this explanation is telling us that cleaving to God will bring us eternal life. The Zohar takes us to a deeper level. Here's what it says in the Zohar, in text number 10. The Torah of God is pure. Fortunate is one who cleaves to the Torah and does not separate from it. For separating from the Torah for even one moment is tantamount to severing oneself from life. As the verse states, for it is your life and the length of your days, and for they shall add length of days and years of life and peace to you. This is a quote from a pasuk. The Zohar is telling us that our life itself is the Torah. That's life itself. And that's why we say in our prayers, Ki heim chayenu va'orach yamenu, for they are life and the length of our days. We say this in the prayers. It comes from the pasuk. It comes from these verses that we're referring to over here. A beautiful story that really demonstrates this point is the incident that took place with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the foremost Torah personality at the time following the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Akiva was the sage by which all of the oral tradition follows. In other words, his principles of interpretation, Rabbi Akiva is the one, it says, V'chulu al liba de Rabbi Akiva. All of them follow the principles of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva was one of the greatest sages ever to live. So in text number 11 we read, the sages taught, one time, the evil empire of Rome decreed that Israel may not engage in the study and practice of Torah. Papas ben Yehuda came and found Rabbi Akiva, who was convening assemblies in public and engaging in Torah study. So he completely flaunted this decree of the Romans. He just, he completely disregarded it. So Papa said to Rabbi Akiva, he said to him, Akiva, are you not afraid of the empire? Rabbi Akiva answered him, I will relate a parable. To what is the matter analogous? It is like a fox who walked along a riverbank and saw fish gathering and fleeing from place to place. The fox said to them, from what are you fleeing? They said to him, we are fleeing from the nets that people cast upon us. He said to them, do you wish to come up onto dry land, and we will reside together just as my ancestors resided with your ancestors? This is the fox talking. The fish said to him, you are the one of whom they say he is the cleverest of animals. Is that so? Really? You're the one who they say he is the cleverest of animals? You are not clever. You are a fool. If we are afraid in the water, our natural habitat that gives us life, then in a habitat that causes our death, all the more so. So too, now that we sit and engage in Torah study, about which it is written, for that is your life and the length of your days, we fear the empire to this extent. If we proceed to sit idle from its study, all the more so we will fear the empire. What his point is here is that just like the fox was wrong to tell the fish, you're afraid of the fisherman's net, come up here on dry land. Over here there's nothing to be afraid of because there's no fisherman's net. They're not fishing for you over there. That obviously is wrong. If they're afraid in the water, certainly they should be afraid on dry land because over there they are disconnecting themselves from their origin, from their source of life. A fish cannot live without water. Even though temporarily it can, very temporarily. And if you throw it back into water, ultimately it's able to return. But that's the life that it has, even on dry land, is only the result of it having been in water earlier. And if you keep it out of water long enough, it simply dies. In a similar way, or in the same way I should say, Jewish people, if they have the Torah, they study Torah, they're connected with Torah, if the Torah is their life, then they're connected with their source. So they're connected with their origin. It's like an umbilical cord. If you disconnect it, then what happens?
We see what's
We know what happens. We know what happens. Okay, so let's unpack this idea a little bit. When we talk about this idea that Torah is our life, we know that there are some very extraordinary limbs within the person and parts of the body, beginning with the mind. Right? The mind is the ultimate of the person. That's what gives a person the quality of life. They can understand, they can communicate. It's in the mind. The heart, also an extraordinary part of the person. The feet, well, maybe not as sophisticated, maybe not as rich in ability, but movement is an incredible part, very important part of life. If I were to ask you the question though, where is life? Is it more in the mind? Is it more in the heart? Is it more in the feet? What would you say?
I would say in the mind.
No, everywhere.
You're conscious in your mind, but where's life? Could you pin down life to any specific area to say that life is in my mind? My feet, that's just an attachment I put on and I take off sometimes.
But the brain controls everything.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain does control everything. The heart pumps blood everywhere. And the stomach digests the food, and each one functions and has its own role to play. But if you were to ask yourself, where's life? Where is life? In the mind more than in the heart, more than in the feet? Not necessarily. Life is everywhere. You're alive in your entire body. In text number 12, a human being is comprised of many parts. Generally speaking, we divide these into three categories: head, body, and feet. The head hosts the sublime abilities, such as intellect, etc., as well as the senses of sight, hearing, etc. The body hosts emotions and the like, and the feet host only the ability to walk, which is the lowest of a person's functions in that it does not express the unique abilities of mankind. It's just not as sublime, right? However, this all pertains not to one's specific abilities, but to one's essential soul vitality, which transcends the specific functions and is found equally in the entire body from head to foot. The reason is that this soul vitality is the essence of a person. It is therefore found equally in every aspect of the body. So there's this essential you that is existent within every part of you.
Oh, it was the Rebbe who said that.
Yeah, that's the Rebbe's teaching. So even though the body might not be the essence of the person, but it's specifically within the body that the essence is manifest. Everywhere within the body. It's you. This is you. That's you. It's every part of you is you. It's all you. And this is encapsulated in 5 words that the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, once taught, perhaps in a different context, but this is what he says in text number 13. One's core is associated specifically with their body. It's specifically in the body that you see, you're able to see that the core kind of penetrates every part of the person. It's all you. It's all part of you. To illustrate this point further, there's a very interesting story that's taught in the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I mentioned Rabbi Akiva earlier. He was post-destruction of the temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was during the time of the destruction.
First destruction?
Second.
Okay.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the leader of rabbinic Jewry at the time. Now, mind you, Judaism was very splintered. There were many different factions. There was a faction that felt very strongly that they had to fight the Romans. The Pharisees, the Prushim, led by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and others, several others, felt strongly that we should not fight the Romans under those circumstances. It wasn't worthwhile to fight the Romans. So these two factions were both in Jerusalem, in the old city, and a lot of tension between them.
It reminds what's today that some very religious say we should not להתגרות בגויים, and some say.
Perhaps it's reminiscent of that, but this is the idea. What happened? There were two factions that basically were struggling for control over Jerusalem, and the extreme, very very extreme youth decided that they were going to burn down all of the resources that were available to continue surviving in Jerusalem. It would force everybody to fight against the Romans. So, without getting into the details of the story, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is smuggled out of Jerusalem. They made believe he was dead. They took him out. They said, we have to bury him. and they take him out of Jerusalem. The Romans let him out. And when he's out, he gets out of the coffin and he goes and meets Vespasian, which was the Roman emperor's ambassador or general, military commander, to go about laying siege to Jerusalem. So he goes to meet Vespasian. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells him that he is going to become the emperor. And the text tells us in text number 14, in the meantime, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian were talking, a messenger arrived from Rome and said to him, "Rise, for the emperor has died, and the noblemen of Rome plan to appoint you, Vespasian, as their leader, and make you the next emperor." At that time, Vespasian was wearing only one shoe, and when he tried to put on the other one, it would not go on his foot. He then tried to remove the other shoe that he was already wearing, but it would not come off. He said, "What is this?" Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, "Be not distressed or troubled, for good tidings have reached you. As it is written, good tidings make the bone fat," meaning your feet have grown fatter out of joy and satisfaction. Vespasian said to him, "But what is the remedy to get my shoe on?" Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai replied, "Have someone with whom you are displeased come and pass before you. As it is written, a broken spirit dries the bones." He did this, and his shoe went on his foot. Now, whether or not this is scientific, this is what the verse tells us, that Shmua Teva Tadashinotzim, that there will be a physical effect a physical response to our emotional state. So when we are happy, for example, we are joyous, what do? We can't sit in one place. What do? We get up and we dance. It expresses itself in bodily movement. The entire body is dancing. It's an expression of the life that's within you. I'm happy. I'm joyous. So it expresses itself through the entire body. So, in text number 15a, an abstract example of this concept. When a person thinks about something joyous, the proof that the joy is real and has spread to his entire being is when it finds expression not only in his thought and speech, but also in his deed, to the point of dancing with their feet. The same is true of other emotions, such as love, fear, or conversely pain and the like. This illustrates the concept that the Torah is our life. The revelation and expression of the fact that the Torah is the very identity and life of a person is when the Torah affects not only all aspects of the soul and lofty spiritual matters, but also in bodily matters and in all details of physical life. So using this analogy of how the spirit, the emotional state of a person affects their body, their physical being, we can use that in the analog to explain how Torah being our life itself, as we talked about earlier, has an effect not just on our spiritual state, but on our physical state. So the proof, the litmus test, that we've identified with Torah as it being our very life, what's the litmus test for that? When it has an effect in our physical world, when it has an effect in our physical state of affairs. If it only has an effect on our spiritual state, then there's some disconnect between us and the Torah. If we connect with the Torah as it is, our life, kihem chayenu, truly our life, then it's going to have an effect not just on our spiritual state, and in reference to what we talked about earlier, it's not just going to have an effect in terms of our reward in a spiritual sense, but it's going to have an effect in terms of our physical reaping a reward. And so that's the reason why the Torah specifically identifies physical reward over spiritual reward. Because spiritual reward, it's a given. Obviously, it's going to change your spiritual state when you do a mitzvah. But if you connect with Torah fully, you fully embrace and integrate Torah into your life as though it is really the source of your life, which it truly is, then it should have an effect also on your physical state. In text number 15b, if the reward for altruistic Torah study was only lofty spiritual revelations, we would still lack a full indication that Torah is a person's full identity. Such reward would essentially amount to a natural product of his Torah study, a spiritual reward for a spiritual service. But when one receives material goodness for a spiritual service of following a Torah life, as in the verse, I will give your rains in their time, and the tree of the field will give forth its fruit, etc., it becomes evident that the person's religious lifestyle is not merely a discipline and practice they have superimposed upon their persona, or just a detail of life. Rather, it becomes evident that the Torah is their entire identity. Precisely because Torah is the person's entire identity, it brings goodness and positive results in all aspects of life, including material matters. And that's what the Torah is trying to highlight here. It goes without saying, it's a given, we take it for granted. Yeah, of course, when you study Torah, you involve yourself in Torah, it's going to affect your spiritual state. That goes without saying. The chiddush, the novelty, is that it has an effect in the physical world. And that's what the Torah identifies specifically, the physical reward. And so what the lesson is for us over here is that we need not focus on the reward per se and try on the different hats that we wear for their size, but rather we have to focus on making Yiddishkeit, making Torah and mitzvahs our identity. This has becomes who we are. We are synonymous. The Torah and us are synonymous. We exude it. It is so ingrained within us. It is so internalized that it's something that we simply it shines through. It shines through. And that comes from keeping our eyes focused on the prize. The prize is, does God want this? The prize is connecting to God and God's will, which is reflected in the Torah. And when we do that, that becomes our identity. And then, spiritual reward is to be had, and physical reward is to be had. It's all natural outcome of all of that. But the focus has to be making it truly something that's part of our lives. There's a story here which I've mentioned in the past, and I'll share it again because I think it has value in a number of different conversations. One of them happens to be ours. There was a Reform rabbi whose name was Herbert Weiner. And the Rebbe used to refer to him as my Shaliach Weiner, my Shaliach, my emissary to the Reform movement. He came and interviewed the Rebbe. He wrote a book called 9.5 Mystics. And the Rebbe's featured there as one of them. And this fellow, Herbert Weiner, obviously, who was coming from a different perspective than the Orthodox, than religious, than the Hasidic. So he came to the Rebbe on a number of occasions, apparently, and on one time he asked the Rebbe, he says, I look at your students, he writes, I pressed my question from another angle and told him, this is to the Rebbe, I'm just going to read it out because he articulates it best, that I sensed a desire in Chabad to oversimplify, to strip ideas of their complexity merely for the sake of superficial clarity. As a matter of fact, I blurted out, he's writing here what he said to the Rebbe. So I blurted this out. All his Hasidim seem to have one thing in common, a sort of open and naive look in their eyes that a sympathetic observer might call tmimut, purity, but that might less kindly be interpreted as emptiness or simple-mindedness, the absence of inner struggle. It's interesting how he characterizes this, the inner struggle. I found myself taken aback by my own boldness, but the Rebbe showed no resentment. He leaned forward. What you see missing from their eyes is a kera. A what? I asked. Yes, a kera. He repeated quietly. A split. The Rebbe hesitated for a moment. I hope you will not take offense, but something tells me you don't sleep well at night. And this is not good for length of days, for arichas yomim, meaning for having a long life. Yeah. Perhaps if you had been raised wholly in one world or in another, it might be different. But this split is what comes from trying to live in two worlds. If you're trying to live in two worlds, and you're straddling this defense, you can't make up your mind where, you know what I mean? You don't sleep well at night. and that's a euphemism. Sleeping well at night is a euphemism. It means you have a kera. It means you have this split. There's this struggle that's going on in terms of, what's the correct path or what's the ultimate purpose, and ultimately you don't have either. You live life in a struggle. So the Rebbe says to him that what you're seeing in my Hasidim is not a simple-mindedness. It's not a it's tamimut. That was his generous way of saying it. But it's not a lack of sophistication. It is a lack of living in two different worlds. Lack of struggling between living in a world that kind of sees itself, as we've been talking about in the last classes, the independence of the physical, the independence of our reality from God, and then seeing things from God's reality, where the world is an extension of Him and there for a purpose, which is to fulfill the mitzvahs and Torah, etc. So there is this tension between the two, and if you try to straddle both of them, meaning if you're philosophically devoted to keeping both these perspectives, in other words, maintaining both these perspectives, then you're going to have trouble. You're going to live in a very tense world, because there's a tug of war going on.
Wait, say again what the tug of war is between.
The tug of war is between, where was this individual coming from? He was coming from a very secular perspective. Right. And he's coming to Hasidim and he's saying, I see they look very tmimusdik, they look very simple-minded, non-sophisticated. So the Rebbe answers him that what you're seeing is not a lack of sophistication, it's a lack of a kera, it's a lack of a split. You're not seeing, they're not being torn in two different directions. And it seems from the Rebbe that a more healthy lifestyle, even on a physical level, to sleep better at night, is not to have that kera in the first place. Not to create that tension in the first place. Yes, obviously we need to engage the world, we need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to go to work, we need to do the things we need to do. But in terms of our philosophy, how do we go about looking at the world? We want to look at the world through God's lenses. We want to look at the world through God's lenses of what the purpose is and what we need to strive for, what we need to consider valuable. These are the values that God gives us, the absolute values. If we're struggling to find, let's just get an example. If we're struggling to find secular support for Torah's values, we're going to have a hard time. We're going to really have a very hard time. We're going to end up cutting down one or the other. It's either the Torah's values that are going to suffer or the secular values that are going to suffer. They're not going to coexist. I'll just give you an example. A certain individual, without mentioning any names, has written on a number of occasions that, like an open letter to God. The open letter to God is, we like this idea of a temple, but we don't like this idea of slaughtering animals for sacrifices. Now, granted, there remains explanation to be had in why God asks us to slaughter animals and bring them as sacrifices in the temple. It deserves explanation, it deserves an answer. However, the Torah values life, the Torah values the life of the animal. And yet the Torah tells us that under certain circumstances, God wants us to slaughter an animal and bring it as a sacrifice. So God, who created the animal, God who created our conscience, God who created this reality in which we have these values, is telling us this is the right thing to do here. Another example.
Isaac.
Isaac. Beautiful example, great example. Another example is when the Jewish people arrive in Israel, God tells them that now, for this particular act, meaning the act of conquering the land, you are to get rid of every single last human being who's alive in the land of Israel today. Now that obviously doesn't exist today. We don't have any obligation to kill anybody, God forbid. That's just not what God asked us to do. It was the first time the Jews entered the land of Canaan, they were instructed to remove everybody. So from a purely humanistic perspective, we ask the question, and truthfully, if we value human life, it should, it's an important question. It's how do we ultimately we go back and we say, look, let's look at the world through God's lenses. But if we try to toe the line, if we try to, we try to reconcile between the two sets of values, then we're gonna be living in a very, very strong tension, very intense struggle, because ultimately this is God's absolute values, and these are human created values. These are values that human beings came up with.
That you shouldn't kill?
Our value of not killing, our value of life, comes from God's value of human life. In other words, when Torah tells us not to kill, and Torah tells us to value life, so that's where our value of life comes from. That's an absolute value. It's like I was saying before with regard to the chesed that people do, right? So people have this idea, they're willing to give, but not because God said so, because I think it's a good thing. So what happens in the end? The end is, if we just simply rely on human intellect to guide our morals, to guide our values, ultimately society devolves. If it's not rooted, if it's not grounded in an anchor that's absolute, meaning it's